I'm Sophia Thakur. I'm a London-based, but now touring, spoken word artist, songwriter and poet. Well, I think poet and spoken word artist are the same thing. I started off doing just performance poetry, and then last year I penned down my performance and wrote my first book. As well as that, I work with a lot of singers and rappers, songwriting for them, for their own music. So anything to do with words, just very, very word-based. I can't actually remember when I first got into spoken word or poetry. In fact, I just make up answers now when people ask me because I genuinely can't remember. But I do remember the first time I realised that poetry was a call for change. I was in secondary school and there was a poetry competition in my school. And I didn't go to a diverse school at all. Oh, I mean, it was diverse, but it wasn't. The majority of my classmates were white, Irish, but there weren't many people of colour in my school at that time. Now it's completely different, but at the time there wasn't many. Why it's so important to sleep, because if we didn't sleep, we wouldn't dream. And if we didn't dream, then Martin Luther King might not have had his I Have a Dream speech, and God knows where America would be at the moment. God knows where we'd all be at the moment. And I remember reciting it to my mum. My mum was like, no, there's no way you're going on stage in your very, very, very English school and performing this poem. And it was funny because she was the first generation in London from Gambia and Sri Lanka, which is where she was from. She had always been told to sort of quiet down her colour so as to assimilate, and that was a means of survival for her, but of course it was a different time with my generation. So I went on stage and I performed the poem anyway, and I ended up winning the poetry competition, and it started a lot of interesting conversations around me. And then I thought, oh, actually, people listen when you put it in a poem because it sits inside this really charming space, which is not fully art, but not fully conversation. And with conversation, I can speak to you and you can understand what I'm saying. But with art, you go beyond skin and you sort of penetrate the heart or the mind, and you really impact people in a way that sometimes just speaking can't. And poetry sits in between the two, so I've seen it have that same impact, but I've also seen it be so digestible. And I just thought, with an art form that is so powerful and digestible to anyone, it's such a perfect way to invoke emotion or invoke thought that can then promote change. I didn't always read poetry books. It wasn't until I was actually writing my first poetry book I thought, oh, okay, I should read some. But prior to that point, because I was a performance artist, I was watching performance poetry, so I was enjoying the George the Poets, the Silly Breaks, all of the Def Jam poetry is what I have grown up on. That's pretty much injected in me. Slam poetry as well in America. That was what I grew up on, and hip hop artists and storytellers. And then when I started writing the book, I thought, okay, I need to read some poetry collections. I need to know what it looks like on the page. And a friend of mine, I went to dinner with a friend of mine called Nina, and she gave me this book called The Anatomy of Being. And she put on a post-it note at the front of the book, I hope this book gives you all of the answers. And at the time, I didn't really have any questions, so I just thought, oh, it's Nina being Nina. But I didn't realise that it was going to ask it was just going to fill out so many spaces that were question marks in me and in my person. I just thought, I had never seen poetry done like that on the page. It wasn't the poetry that we learnt in school, it wasn't the spoken word that I was used to, it was just this really intense, potent, it was like a hand coming through the book and just like pulling you into the story. And I thought, this is incredible, I want to create something like this. And I haven't really read a collection like that since, until recently. And it's a book called Deaf Republic. The best advice that I got, the way I look at poetry and the poetry sort of business and world is, if you believe in poetry and you love poetry and you want to do it for the rest of your life, find a way to do it for the rest of your life. And sometimes it means you have to talk about difficult topics or bring poetry into a space that perhaps might not welcome it with open arms at first. But if you do believe in the power of poetry, you have to be brave in bringing it to those spaces. And one of the best pieces of advice I got was from a poet called Kareem Parkins Brown, and he said that all of our stories are worth telling. The art is in how well you can make someone else listen to it and relate to it. And since then it's sort of shaped my why with poetry, and my big why with poetry is to bring people a bit closer to themselves. And so I would encourage any poet, whether you're a songwriter, whether you're an author, whether you're just a communicator, as long as your job is finessing with words, don't be afraid to tell your story in its vulnerability, because in doing so you liberate other people's, and you liberate the stories inside other people that will bring them closer to themselves. And I think as a whole, when you look at society, we could all do with being brought a little bit closer into ourselves to learn empathy and compassion. If I wasn't a poet, I don't know, I feel like I'd still be something to do with words. I'd probably be a full-time songwriter, but I think that's a bit of a cop-out because that's basically poetry. I would like to think that I would have still been in sport. So I was really into sports when I was young. I used to play basketball and I used to run athletics. I used to run 100 metres and hurdles. So I like to think maybe, but then again I stopped because I had to stop, so maybe not. But I would definitely love to work in creative marketing, because I think, like poetry or like words anywhere, that we consume, like we're a generation of consuming so many things, and I think if we're tasteful and intentional in how we create products to be consumed, there's so much good that can be done in terms of broadening people's mindsets, in terms of encouraging compassion and empathy. So yeah, maybe creative marketing, or creative marketer that is also a basketball player and songwriter.